It started with a sound no homeowner ever expects to hear outside their own gate. Metal snapping, chain tearing, a lock being destroyed in broad daylight. No warning, no notice, just someone deciding they had the right to take what wasn't theirs. By the time I stepped outside, my Jeep was already halfway gone, my property treated like a violation instead of something I'd worked for. The person responsible wasn't a thief in the shadows. It was someone with a clipboard, a title, and the confidence that comes from believing rules protect you no matter what you do. In this neighborhood, power didn't come from the law, it came from the HOA. A single complaint could turn into fines. A single rule could be twisted into punishment. And today, that power crossed a line that couldn't be undone. What they didn't know, what no one thought to ask, was why that Jeep was locked the way it was, or who it actually belonged to. They assumed silence meant surrender. They assumed authority meant immunity. But the moment that lock hit the ground, everything changed. Because this wasn't just about a vehicle anymore. It was about overreach, arrogance, and a mistake that would bring consequences no HOA rulebook could erase. So what happens when a neighborhood tyrant touches the wrong property, and wakes up forces far bigger than an HOA ever imagined? Before everything unraveled, life in the neighborhood moved at a predictable, almost mechanical pace. Lawns were trimmed on schedule. Trash bins appeared and disappeared like clockwork. People waved without stopping, smiled without asking questions, and stayed carefully within the invisible lines drawn by the homeowners association. It was the kind of place designed to look peaceful from the outside, even if that peace was held together by rules instead of trust. I had moved there for that exact reason. After years of instability, I wanted quiet. A place where I could park my Jeep, lock my gate, and disappear into my routine without anyone paying too much attention. I wasn't loud. I wasn't careless. I followed the rules that actually made sense and ignored the ones that felt like they existed only to remind people who was in charge. For the most part, that balance worked. My days were simple. Early mornings. Long hours away. Coming home late, tired, and grateful that nothing had changed while I was gone. The Jeep stayed parked in the same spot, secured behind a locked gate on my property, out of the way and out of sight. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't new. But it mattered to me. It represented freedom, work, and responsibility. It was part of the structure of my life, even if no one else understood why. The neighborhood, however, had its own structure. And at the center of it sat the HOA, a small group of residents who believed order only existed if someone enforced it aggressively. They sent emails about paint shades. They measured grass. They left warning slips on windshields for things most people didn't even notice. Their presence was constant but impersonal, like surveillance without cameras. At first, I barely registered them. HOA rules were background noise, something you skimmed and forgot as long as you didn't cause trouble. And I wasn't causing trouble. I kept my head down. I paid dues. I didn't attend meetings. I assumed that was enough. But communities like this don't run on neutrality. They run on attention. And attention, once focused, rarely looks away. It started small, the kind of thing you'd dismiss if you weren't paying close attention. A notice about parking alignment. A reminder about visible vehicles. A vague warning referencing community standards, without clearly explaining what had been violated. Each message was polite on the surface, but firm underneath, carrying the unspoken assumption that compliance was not optional. I told myself it was routine, automated, harmless. Everyone probably got them. That's how these systems stay powerful, by making pressure feel normal. Still, something shifted. I noticed people lingering longer when they walked past my gate. I caught the same HOA board member driving by more often than coincidence could explain. There was a specific kind of stare that didn't feel curious, but evaluative, like someone measuring whether you fit into their idea of the neighborhood. The Jeep became a focal point without me realizing it. Not because it violated a clear rule, but because it stood out just enough to attract scrutiny. It wasn't parked crooked. It wasn't blocking anything. It simply existed in a way that didn't align perfectly with the aesthetic the HOA wanted to project. In places like this, perception matters more than legality. And perception is shaped by the people who feel entitled to control it. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone had. A neighbor fined for leaving decorations up too long. Another threatened over a fence repair that hadn't been pre-approved. Someone else dealing with escalating warnings over something as small as where they placed their trash bins. The stories always carried the same lesson. Once the HOA decided you were a problem, the rules became weapons. I never thought I'd be on that list. I wasn't confrontational. I didn't push back publicly. I didn't challenge authority. I assumed that respect and silence would keep me invisible. But invisibility doesn't protect you when someone decides to test their power. The notices became more specific, more frequent. Language shifted from reminders to enforcement. There was talk of violations that didn't exist, timelines that felt arbitrary, and consequences that seemed disproportionate. Each message stopped just short of a threat, but together they painted a clear picture. Someone wanted control, and my property had become their leverage. What made it worse was the certainty behind it all. The confidence that came from believing rules were on their side, regardless of context. The belief that if something looked wrong to them, it must be wrong. And that belief didn't leave room for explanation. I considered responding. I considered asking for clarification. But experience had taught me that engagement often invites escalation. So I stayed quiet, assuming reason would eventually prevail. Assuming common sense would step in before things went too far. That assumption would prove costly. Because while I was living my routine, trusting that locked gates and private property still meant something, someone else was building a case in their head. A narrative where enforcement justified intrusion. Where authority outweighed boundaries. Where rules mattered more than ownership. And once that narrative took hold, it no longer mattered that the Jeep was secured, that it wasn't causing harm, or that it sat exactly where it always had. It became a symbol. A challenge. An opportunity. By the time I sensed that something was truly wrong, the process was already in motion. Decisions had been made without my involvement. Permissions assumed without consent. Lines blurred between what the HOA could demand and what they simply wanted to take. I still believed the situation would resolve itself. That logic would intervene. That no one would dare cross a line so obvious it couldn't be ignored. I was wrong. Because in neighborhoods ruled by unchecked authority, the most dangerous moment isn't when a rule is enforced. It's when someone decides the rules give them the right to act first and explain later. And that decision was already heading straight for my locked gate. The shift from annoyance to intimidation didn't happen all at once. It arrived in layers, each one subtle enough to explain away, but heavy enough to leave a mark. What had once been occasional notices turned into a steady stream of enforcement letters, each more confident than the last. The language hardened. Deadlines shortened. Consequences became the focus. It was no longer about maintaining community standards. It was about control. The Jeep was now mentioned directly. Not with clarity, but with accusation. Phrases like unauthorized vehicle presence and non-compliant parking appeared without explanation, as if stating them made them true. There were no photos. No timestamps. No reference to any specific rule I could verify. Just conclusions, already reached, already decided. I reread the HOA handbook line by line, expecting to find something I'd missed. But the rules were vague by design. They left room for interpretation, and interpretation belonged to whoever held authority. That ambiguity became their weapon. The fines followed. Small at first. Easy to ignore if you believed logic would intervene. Then larger. Then stacked. Late fees appeared before due dates had even passed. Notices referenced previous violations that had never been explained. Each letter assumed guilt as a starting point. I felt the pressure build quietly. Not through confrontation, but through persistence. Every envelope was a reminder that someone was watching. Every notice was a test to see how much I would tolerate. Then came the final notice. It arrived without emphasis, almost casually, tucked among the others as if it were routine. It stated that due to continued non-compliance, corrective measures would be taken to restore community standards. The timeline was immediate. The language final. No appeal. No delay. The morning everything changed started like any other. Quiet. Uneventful. I left early, locked the gate behind me, and drove away without incident. By the time I returned later that day, something felt wrong before I even saw it. The stillness was different. The air heavy. The gate, once secure, hung slightly ajar. And where the lock should have been, there was nothing but broken metal on the ground. That was the moment frustration turned into disbelief. Because the HOA hadn't just escalated. It had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. The moment I realized the Jeep was gone, the situation stopped being about HOA rules and became something far more serious. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't overreach wrapped in paperwork. This was theft, carried out with confidence, in broad daylight, by people who believed their authority insulated them from consequences. The broken lock on the ground wasn't just metal. It was proof. Proof that someone had stepped onto private property, destroyed secured equipment, and removed something they had no legal right to touch. By the time the truth surfaced, it hit like a shockwave. Vehicles arrived that didn't belong to residents. People showed up who didn't ask permission or care about neighborhood aesthetics. Authority, real authority, had entered the picture. The reality was unavoidable. The Jeep they had seized wasn't just protected property. It was connected to a police task force operation. And they had cut the lock themselves. The HOA's power, once absolute, suddenly looked fragile. Meetings were cancelled. Notices stopped arriving. Fear replaced confidence. The towing company distanced itself immediately. Responsibility shifted, but gravity pulled it back to the source. The HOA tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, but misunderstandings don't involve broken locks and seized property. The climax wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It unfolded through paperwork, presence, and the quiet authority of people who didn't need to explain themselves. The HOA had crossed into territory where its rules meant nothing. And everyone knew it. What followed wasn't explosive or dramatic. The Jeep was returned quietly. The lock was replaced. Heavier, stronger, final. Time passed, and the neighborhood settled into a new normal. The HOA still existed, but it no longer operated unchecked. The Jeep still sits behind that gate. The lock still holds. And the neighborhood still looks peaceful to anyone passing through. But beneath that surface, something fundamental has changed. So the question isn't whether HOAs should exist, or whether rules matter. The real question is this. What happens when the people enforcing the rules forget that they're bound by them too? Because sometimes, all it takes is one broken lock to remind everyone where the real boundaries are.